Former campaign advisor Bruce Hawker and former ABC board member Janet Albrechtsen, now a columnist with The Australian. Janet, which script should the Abbott government follow? You know, share the pain, raise taxes, or we made a mistake, we'll cut taxes?
I don't think they have any alternative but to, and this is the script they're obviously doing, which is to share the burden, share the burden of repairing the budget, because the alternative is that the Abbott government will be accused of launching a class war on the poor if the burden of repairing the budget is not shared around. So it's shared around in terms of cuts to business welfare, corporate welfare, the debt tax, as we'll see on Tuesday.
Happy with that argument, except they did promise not to raise taxes. That applies, though, to the wealth tax, so to speak, the deficit levy on higher income earners. How does that apply to the raising the fuel excise levy? That hits everyone. It
certainly hits everybody, but it's also an economically responsible thing to do. But Howard did the wrong thing in 2001 when he removed indexation, because you know
because we need more taxes.
No, well, I'm not in favour of more taxes, Andrew. But if you're going, to repair the budget, you have to look at the spending side. You have to look at the taxation side. Okay?
Do you, Bruce? I mean, I was told before the election that you didn't need to raise taxes because taxes weren't the problem, spending was, and I believed it.
Well, this is the big problem for Tony Abbott. You know, he could have learnt from the July incident, and he could learn from LAW Law and Paul Keating, but he's decided to ignore all that and break 2 election promises, no new taxes, and he's going to introduce 2 new taxes, and I think that's going to be very damaging for him. I think the fuel levy, though, is going to be much more damaging in his heartland than the deficit tax. I think most people will probably wear that because, you know, they don't earn $180,000 or more, or whatever the amount is when it's going to kick in. But the fuel levy is going right to the heart of his constituency, particularly in the bush, and I think there's going to be a lot of unhappy people up in the country and in the suburbs railing against that and saying we were sold a pup.
Janet,
there's a bigger promise, isn't there? And that is to repair the budget. So Abbott got himself into a terrible bind, and the bigger promise at the end of his election cycle, will be whether he has repaired the budget. And I think, as much as none of us like broken promises, and Abbott shouldn't have got himself into that position, the judgment will be made by voters when the election comes around as to whether the budget has been repaired.
That's the bigger promise. I just wonder why you would throw away your good name for these taxes. I would have cut the spending. That is what the mandate's for. But one of the cuts, I think, will get a big tick, obviously, Bruce, and that's this announcement or leak that the politicians' pay rises will be frozen, top public servants too. Politics of envy, all this kind of stuff.
That would have been mugs not to go down that path. And this goes to this argument about sharing the burden. Of course, politicians are never going to share the burden like somebody on the lowest rung in the economy, and that's pensioners. Another broken promise, by the way, to aged and disabled pensioners, that they wouldn't touch pensions. They're going to do that. So, yes, they had to go down that path of saying we will take a freeze on our pay, but really it doesn't count when you're on about $200,000 plus and more for ministers to take a pay freeze. It's just, yes, it doesn't hurt them.
It's still, no, hang on. They're not only having to pay the deficit levy, the fuel excise, the this, the that, everything else, all the charges, the Medicare, if they go to the... they'll also have to now cop a wage freeze. So I don't think that's right.
Tell that to the electorate, Andrew.
But listen,
no one will buy that.
We, as commentators, have to make a distinction between what's good politics and what's rational. Don't you think? This is just picking on politicians.
I agree. I think, and in terms of also, you know, the reining in of the gold... what is it called? The gold pass.
Yes.
All of this is important in terms of selling the budget. All of these measures.
That's right. That's what it's about.
You cannot disconnect, you know, the politics from the policy in this. It's always been that. Right. We live in a democracy and people are going to be making judgments on this. And on Tuesday night, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to feel very, very disappointed about a government that said it wasn't going to introduce new taxes and has, wasn't going to touch age and disability pensions and has, and wasn't going to touch other institutions and will. So that's a big problem.
Can I make a point about broken promises, though? You know, there are broken promises and there are broken promises. Julia Gillard's carbon tax next broken promise was about cementing her power. It was about placating the Greens, and she was judged very harshly by voters on that. I'm not justifying Tony Abbott's broken promises, except to say that voters will make their own judgment on that. And when you put the two together, the ones that the promises that Abbott is breaking go to repairing the budget. They're not about cementing his position in power. Quite the opposite, in fact,
they're
because
not
they're
about
risky.
imposing a stupid carbon tax that actually hurts people. This is about fixing a budget to help people.
So I think there are differences.
But I think that is a point. And here's another thing,
But
Bruce.
that's going
it's
to
all
this
very
core
well.
non-core promise area, you know, and I think you've got to be
No,
very
I don't
careful
think it's
about
an argument
that.
for the Abbott government to make, all right?
Well,
but
no, I don't think it is.
I think voters will make that decision.
Voters will make a decision in 2 or 3 years' time about whether this has been all worth it or whether they're feeling so much pain that they just feel that this government has just gone too fast with its cuts and is hurting too many people.
But Bruce, why is this pain necessary? I think the debate really needs to include that. Why is this pain necessary? And particularly, what is Bill Shorten going to say the day after the budget in the address in reply, right? Because there is something to fix. He can't keep pretending there isn't. You go through what the Liberals have proposed by, directly or by leaks, and Labor's response, right? The disability changes announced yesterday to get more people off disability pensions and into the workforce. They're against. Deficit levy, they're against. Fuel excise increase, they're against. Medicare co-payments, again, Labor's against. Rise in pension age, Labor's against. I could go through the list.
Welcome to opposition. Welcome to opposition.
What the hell are they for?
And what did Tony Abbott do for 3 years when he was opposition? They're exactly the same.
That's all very well, but there's a problem, and Labor is against every single thing proposed to
And
fix
it's a problem created by Labor. I mean, it is a problem created by Labor.
And that was why, in the view of the government, they were elected. But they came into a government saying there'll be no new taxes, no cuts to pensions, no cuts to disability.
This is the blame game.
But that's very important because people are going to judge them on that.
What about the problem we're facing? What's Labor's solution?
Well, that's for Bill Shorten to be talking about when he does his address and reply. But, when he introduced his last budget, he announced significant changes. The baby bonus was going. There was going to be a graduated return to surplus.
Now, Bruce.
But that's for him to say. That's for him to say in light of what's being said now.
Labor's policy so far has been to oppose everything. I don't think that's credible.
Well, it's not, because it says Labor is basically saying, oh, we're happy with a budget projected deficit of $47 billion. Oh, we're happy with the fact that disability support pensions have doubled in 20 years. Oh, we're happy with the fact that the age pension will cost us by 2030 an extra $93 billion. So basically, by Labor opposing all of these changes,
they're not saying all those
we're
things.
happy with that.
What they're saying, what they will say is that we will put our alternative measures to the electorate at the appropriate time, and it'll be in a much more friendly way to people who can least afford to take these cuts. And it won't be the people at the top end, but it will be people out in the electorate who are now going to have to pay more for their petrol, and it's going to affect people who are going to be on pensions in a way that they never thought they were going to be affected. So it's also about the credibility of the government when it goes to the people and says, this is what we will do if we're elected.
That's all very well, Bruce.
Now,
Labor needs solutions.
But Labor did bring down the mini budget.
We've just got a break, and we'll come back with more after the break. And if you didn't think politics could get even nastier, keep watching. Clive Palmer's 4 senators share the balance of power, so it's no joke, kind of. This week, Palmer sued the Queensland Premier for claiming the tycoon had tried to buy the government. But then Palmer was accused by his Chinese business partners in court of siphoning off $12 million, some of which it claims could have been used to pay for his election campaigns. Queensland's Deputy Premier used parliamentary privilege to savage Palmer's party.
The best party that fraudulently obtained money can buy. The best party that a crook using other people's money can buy.
Bruce, those allegations, they're unproven and denied, we should say, would kill most political leaders. Why don't they seem to hurt Clive Palmer?
Well, Clive Palmer is an anti-politician politician. And at a time when the electorate is, I think, out as a jury on both Labor and the Coalition, there's always going to be a place for someone like him. I mean, his history is as an advisor to Joe Bajelki-Peterson. I remember, I grew up in Queensland. I was on the Student Representative Council at the same time that he was. He comes from a very strong line of politicians who set themselves up as being against the others. And as such, he will always get a group in the community who are prepared to back him because he's the alternative.
But this is weird, Janet. He gets those sort of allegations about the money side of stuff don't seem to hurt him. Whereas you contrast it to what Joe Hockey had to undergo this week, which I thought was disgraceful, right? Fairfax newspapers smeared Joe, the Treasurer, claiming he was for sale. Now, the implication is clearly he's corrupt because he had a fundraising scheme where donors could meet him. Now, Labor has those sort of things too, and they're not corrupt unless money actually buys you a decision in your favour. And there's no evidence of that. Why is the Fairfax media going after Joe Hockey like that? And why not do it to Clive Palmer?
Well, let me dare suggest that perhaps some in the media see Clive Palmer as a problem for Tony Abbott, and therefore he seems to get a few free kicks that other politicians wouldn't. I think that's the case on the ABC. I think it's the case in Fairfax. But there's also this about Clive Palmer. He issues writs for defamation all over. Left, right and centre, he's got defamation cases. That probably has a chilling effect, I think, in some media outlets. It hasn't at the Australian. I think the Australian has led the way in putting the spotlight on Clive, and he's responded by saying, oh, well, it's like, Joseph Goebbels with all this nonsense. I mean, he provides a lot of colour and light, but Clive Palmer should expect a whole lot more scrutiny, And these allegations that have arisen this week in relation to the litigation about where did that $12 million go? Was it used for campaign purposes? That raises legitimate questions that need to be answered. And if it was, as you say, in relation to any other politician, every media outlet in Australia would be jumping up and down. But there's a double standard. And don't forget, in terms of voters and Clive Palmer, because they are basically voting against the major parties when they vote for Clive, because he's a populist protest politician, they probably don't look enough at who he is.
That's right. And look, that smear that Fairfax did of Joe Hockey I thought was disgraceful, but he seems to be a walking pinboard at the moment. We've had Channel 9, Tut Tut, and a lot of the media with him, and it's gone viral on Twitter when Joe Hockey and the Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, were caught outside Hockey's office smoking cigars, trying to do it in private. You can only see the top of their head and a plume of smoke. What's wrong with the cigar?
Andrew, he looked like a plutocrat on a monopoly board. He looked terrible. For somebody to be smoking what is essentially the symbol of big business and power in that way, when he's about to bring down a budget which is going to slug a lot of people who can't afford to smoke cigars, was just a very bad look. And he should have his minders all over him saying, Joe, don't do things like that.
So there'd be no problem if he had just smoked a cigarette?
It's sad, isn't it, that politicians can't have a private life? It is sad, and you feel for them, but...
Why can't he smoke a cigar? He can smoke a cigarette. This is ridiculous.
Because it's a perception,
So for the next 2 years, he can't go in a limo, he can't be seen in an expensive restaurant, he can't be seen in a tux because people will say, whoa. I mean, is the politics of class envy just gone out of control in this country?
It's just a very, very bad image. And when you get into the business, though, of slugging people who can least afford it, then you can expect to get a bit of the same in return.
I think it was the wrong week to be smoking a cigar.
Sure was.
Wait a few weeks.
And
cigar sales are now going to fall for the next
bad
week.
For your health too.
A new book on Labor by Philip Chubb says Tony Abbott's political tax rattled Kevin Rudd, your former boss, so badly that at one meeting with his top ministers, he hyperventilated and froze so seriously that his chief of staff had to help him to his feet and take him for a walk. How can a man like that be Prime Minister?
I've never heard of that one before, and I've been talking to politicians for a long time, many of whom were quite happy to say terrible things about Kevin Rudd, and never did I hear that one.
A lot of people getting their own back.
Well, I think someone just wants to sell some books, and that's a good way of doing it.
Oh, Philip Chubb's a pretty good journalist, I should imagine.
I'm
this
sure
is
he's got sources.
Rudd's colleagues. Yeah, anyway. Can we go to Nigeria's Boko Haram terrorist group? It's killed thousands of people, slaughtered schoolboys just for going to school, and no one seemed to care, though, until it kidnapped more than 200 girls from a boarding school because it claims education, Western education, but education generally, is against its Islamic faith. The leader later shot this video. Now, Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said this week the head of our counter-terrorism will offer Nigeria help. Is there much we can or should do?
Look, you know, any kind of help that we can do. I don't know what we can do, but I think there ought to be more outrage across the world and putting pressure on Nigeria's political leaders, and I think it's taken far too long. The latest kidnapping, or the kidnapping of the almost 300 girls, took place, I think, on April 16. It really wasn't until Obama said something that there's been much. And what is America doing? You know, I just think there ought to be outrage right across the world in terms of what is happening and the focus on this group for what they are, which is an Islamist terrorist organisation, completely opposed to girls being educated. They'd rather see them enslaved than educated. I'm surprised that, you know, people seem to think that a Twitter hashtag protest is enough, as Ayaan Hirsi Ali wrote late last week. It's not enough. There ought to be more done
Bruce,
on this.
This is what has got me. Jan's right, there should be more outrage, but outrage is all there is. There's Twitter protests and people like Michelle Obama holding signs saying, bring back our girls, and delivering the president's radio address this week. What I think we could do is actually call things by their name. This is not, as Michelle Obama says, a protest just to stop girls, against people who are stopping girls from going to getting an education. We should be protesting about an Islamist group. That word is almost missing always from liberal critiques of what's going on.
No problem with that. I think when you get these ghastly Islamist fundamentalist groups, and there are other fundamentalist groups out there as well from other religions, but when you see it being played out in this way, in such an ugly and frankly, you know, 12th century way, then I think we should be just panning it for all it's worth. This is what these people stand for.
Yeah, but
it's a
I
shocking
find it
thing.
amazing that that is not said. Janet, the most incredible example was in The Guardian today, saying, well, look, it should be, this is caused by global warming.
Yeah, but we've seen these kind of apologists, haven't we? Ever since 9/11, we've seen this kind of apology almost and reticence to call it for what it is. And as you say, it's not just an attack on Western education, it's an attack on Western civilization. That's what it is.
They're killing people, blowing up churches and slaughtering schoolboys. It's not just about girls.